Hello everyone, this is POW Ponder on Weather. In this update, we're going to be talking about a slow moving storm system that's going to bring severe weather and flooding rains through the weekend. So if you're new to the channel, click the subscribe button and the notification bell to get all my daily updates to keep you ahead of the storm. So let's get right to it. Here's the latest satellite imagery this morning as of April the 27th. And you can really see this dynamic system starting to approach the area with these very high clouds over much of Texas. And you can see the just expansion of the wingspan of this system coming out of the real estate it's going to cover as these temperatures have been warming up, as these dew points have been creeping up. We've got a developing trough that's digging in. That's going to be our culprit for our severe weather threat. It's a slow moving threat throughout the week. But we'll walk you through all the details here. Here's the temperatures going on later on this afternoon into Monday. And we got surging temperatures all the way well into the 90s, mid 80s for much of the southeast, going all the way up into the Ohio Valley, even portions of the Northeast. I mean, we're talking, New York City could approach, low 80s, 84 degrees possibly today. Washington, D.C., near 90 degrees. That's some very warm temperatures out ahead of this developing trough. You can see out behind in the west, we've got much colder temperatures. So that's going to be your clash. That's going to be setting the stage for our severe weather threat as we go into later on this afternoon, especially in this evening, and then more of a flooding threat. So here's your dew points. Man, look at the surge of moisture. You can just feel the energy outside. If you live anywhere in the south, you're talking 70s in much of Texas. These higher dew points will continue to surge further northward, getting into the 60s, creeping all the way into Missouri, even into Iowa portions into the 60 dew points. That's going to be ample amount of moisture in the atmosphere to fuel these storms as they move across. Like I mentioned, it's going to be a very slow mover. The reason being, if I expanded the view on the global front so you can really get the full picture and how this is going to play out, here's your warm surge out ahead of it. And much of Texas, much of the central coast, much of the east coast is very warm temperatures today. There's your developing trough that's digging in down in the west. That's bringing some much colder temperatures and even some rain into the desert southwest. And look to the north here. There's your ridge. That's going to be your blocking, and that's going to be the culprit of why this system just crawls across throughout the week for much of the central U.S. and will eventually get into portions of the southern U.S., but it just crawls and it doesn't really go anywhere. So let me set the stage for you. Here's later on this afternoon. We do have an elevated surge over Texas. This is the latest high resolution model as we go into 4 or 5 o'clock this afternoon. These are going to be what they call elevated storms, basically above the cap, which is there's going to be a strong cap over North Texas this afternoon. So that's going to inhibit any severe weather threat for this afternoon as these storms try to rise. Is going to hit that warm layer and knock them back down. But we could have storms that form above that layer, what they call elevated. And those storms could have some small hail and some stronger storms to them. But typically those aren't severe. The severe threat happens later on tonight into this evening out into West Texas and portions of South Texas as that dry line will start to get active. Here's your setup as we go into the evening hours, 6, 7, 8 o'clock. I do expect the dry line to start to get cranking and active over the Texas Panhandle. And there's another piece of energy down here by Del Rio that's also going to be a culprit for large hail and tornadoes. And there's another little small sector over here by portions of Nebraska, getting into extreme northwestern portions of Kansas. So it's also going to be an eye point of severe weather as we go into this afternoon. The Storm Prediction Center has highlighted those areas. In fact, has a slight risk for severe weather for a pretty big area, extending from all the way in the south into Del Rio, Texas. This extends from much of West Texas, going into Oklahoma, even portions of Kansas. And like I mentioned, there's that little culprit right around southeastern Nebraska, as well as northwestern portions of Kansas here, this little area could be under the gun for those stronger thunderstorms as these move across. But look at how the extension, even on a marginal setup, of just the terrain of the real estate of this system that's going to be, kind of taken over with severe weather, extends all the way into Green Bay, going into Chicago, all the way down to the south into San Antonio. Like I mentioned today, yeah, it reaches portions Austin, Waco, Dallas, but you do have a strong cap. So I'm not really expecting much. And this is going to be an overnight threat for today. Here's your hail front, and they do have two hatched risk areas that are going to be a little bit more concerning with those larger hailstones, meaning you have a 10% chance or greater within this zone of seeing potentially a 2-inch plus hailstone. We're talking golf ball size, tennis ball size, possibly baseball size within this sector, as well as portions in and around Lubbock, much into the high plains, getting into portions of Oklahoma could be under the gun for those larger hailstones. But even a slight risk for these areas out in West Texas could see still larger hail extending much of South Texas, getting into Oklahoma. And like I mentioned, where that marginal risk, you still could have a hail threat all the way up into Green Bay later on this evening. And then here's a little bit higher risk for that area by Nebraska. And here's your tornado threat. So there's going to be two sectors again, that threat by Del Rio, where they'll have those larger hailstones, and again, where they're going to have those larger hailstones out here in West Texas, extreme West Texas into the northern panhandle here, and then far southwestern portions of Oklahoma could be under the gun for some tornadoes later on this evening. I do expect this to be more of an evening threat and kind of an overnight threat. And then the smaller threat would extend in portions of the West Texas and getting into Oklahoma. Here's your overall setup on the play out for today. There's your severe threat out in West Texas. We've got that boundary up to the north with a cold front that's going to be extending all the way, traversing to the north. That's going to be the culprit for that severe threat right along that boundary there up in Nebraska, as we have a developing cold front that's going to be moving in with that trough slowly throughout the week. So let me take you through Wednesday. So yeah, like I mentioned, this doesn't really go anywhere anytime soon. So there's going to be spokes of energy. So as we go into the overnight hours, as we wake up on Wednesday morning, there's still going to be some stronger storms in and around Oklahoma, getting into portions of Missouri, as we have spokes of energy coming up from the south. As we go into later on of the day, we'll have more energy coming in. This is your 3 o'clock afternoon radar depiction. Starting to have more energy building over North Texas, more energy building into Oklahoma City, back into Oklahoma. And then we have those training thunderstorms setting up into portions of Missouri, getting into Illinois as these storms really start to get cranking up. There's that other piece of energy right along that boundary with that cold front, like I mentioned, that's going to be setting up for upstate New York and portions of the Northeast later on into Wednesday. There's your hail threat. So as this system will start to creep closer into North Texas, your cap will start to weaken. By then, your hail threat still stays fairly elevated with that hatch risk down by Del Rio again, with that slight risk going all the way into portions Austin, into Waco, into Dallas, and extending a little bit further now into Oklahoma. That's going to be a little bit higher risk for severe weather as we go into the day on Wednesday. But you can see the expansion of where those some elevated hail could be extending all the way up in here to the Northeast, from Buffalo all the way through Missouri to Illinois to Indiana to Ohio, getting into portions of Pittsburgh. Could see some hail with this system, so it covers a large area of real estate. There's your tornado threat as we go into Wednesday. A lot of the same areas, just a little bit further west. It's going to be a very slow moving system, a little bit elevated again into portions of Del Rio down here in far west Texas, southwest Texas, getting into West Texas a little bit further west than what you saw on Tuesday. And then that small tornado threat will extend. Isolated tornado threat would encompass, San Antonio, Austin, Waco, Dallas, getting into Oklahoma City as we go into Wednesday. There's your other culprit along that boundary there, like that little cold front that I showed you up here into the northeast, getting into portions of Rochester as well as into Buffalo. That would be your Wednesday setup. Here's your overall picture of the severe weather threat. It's mainly out West Texas, get into portions of Central Texas and North Texas on Wednesday. There's your heavier rain threat too. So we're going to be looking at flooding rains as the system just continues to start to crawl and slow down, if not stall out at some point, maybe potentially on Wednesday night, really setting some very heavy rain with convective banding. This will traverse across into Missouri, into portions of northwestern Arkansas, much of Indiana, Illinois here, into as well as Indiana, with some very heavy rain as this moves across. There's your radar depiction as we go into Wednesday night. Yeah, these convective banding could really start to set up with training thunderstorms, could pose a flooding threat by then, as we have spokes of energy taking advantage of those warmer dew points and then send waves of rain. And by Wednesday night, we could be looking at flooding concerns going into the overnight hours on Wednesday, as we have these convective training thunderstorms setting right along into Central Texas, into much of North Texas. That'll traverse across into Oklahoma, get into Arkansas, get into Missouri, into Illinois, just portions of far western portions of Tennessee. That will kind of fade out a little bit. Won't be nearly as heavy as you go into Ohio, but man, some very heavy rain setting up. There's your Thursday look. Again, this system really doesn't go anywhere. It still has convective banding and much of North Texas, extending a little bit further south now, getting into Arkansas, Missouri, more portions of southern Illinois by then, and Indiana. There's your severe weather threat on Thursday as the system comes across. Has a highlighted feature of a marginal risk of storms into Pittsburgh, going into Cincinnati, going into portions of Louisville, of some just marginal risk of severe weather as those heavier rains continue to hang on. There's your overall summary of how Thursday will play out. There's your heavier rain start to creep into eastern portions of North Texas, but still right along into Arkansas, getting into Missouri as these very heavy rains continue to unfold. There's your other boundary up into the northeast. That's going to be your culprit for your higher rain amounts of this boundary further northward. And as we go into Friday, that system will have it access dipping down a little bit further to the southeast, but it's going to potentially start to stall out because eventually it's kind of lose its luster and developing, that ridge up to the north, like I showed you. That's just going to continue to block this feature to getting anywhere, get further off into the east here, as it kind of more or less stalls out or kind of fades out. And as we get into Friday, there's that first system right along that boundary there into the northeast with some residual rain showers. And there's that other boundary down to the south where that cold front is going to potentially start to fade and kind of stall out in portions of the south, with those very heavy rains getting into Louisiana, southern portions of Mississippi and Alabama, into the Florida Panhandle. As we go into the weekend, now we're entering May. So with this cold front potentially stalling out, we always have to look for tropical type systems. I'm not expecting anything tropical to come out of this, but this is typically how you would get a tropical type feature in the month of May. I mean, you got to realize the National Hurricane Center is already going to be starting to put out advisories earlier this year. We're talking May 15th. So we're not that far away for them to start issuing or doing daily updates on the tropics. So as we go into May, we're going to have to start looking for these cold fronts that come across, that settle in down to the Gulf of Mexico and get into the Atlantic. And those are typically where you look at on the southwest side of those fronts, have a little low pressure start to spin up. And as these warmer temperatures start to take hold into the Gulf, and as they hit that 80-degree temperature and shear kind of subsides a little bit, we could have enough, enough act together where those dynamics come to play, where we could have an early season setup as we go into May. So it's just something that we have to pay attention to as far as the tropics are concerned, because that's going to be coming into play as we go into May, because I am expecting an early season development this year, sometime in May, as the dynamics look a little bit favorable as these cold fronts get down into the Gulf. And then as conditions can become a little bit more favorable, you could have a little bit, early season spin up out there. So that's just something I'm going to have my eye on as we go into the month of May. But here's your wind over the next, from this system throughout this week and going into the weekend. As far as your higher wind gusts, where that trough digs in, we're going to have some elevated winds. Anywhere in green here, you're talking 40-mile-per-hour gust. Anywhere in red, we're talking upward to 50 to 58, if not 60 miles per hour at times. So that's going to be inundating much of New Mexico, getting into Texas, much of where that boundary is going to be, where that system's going to play out. And then even get into the portions of the mid-Atlantic states where along that boundary with that cold front. So here's your rain setup for the week. And this is the latest European model. It has that ridge, acting as a blocking pattern, and doesn't really have the rain going into the Carolinas and much of Florida, with those very heavy rains setting up over Texas, getting into portions of Louisiana, into Arkansas, Oklahoma, into Missouri, and a boundary of, into Illinois, as far as Indiana, and a little bit lesser amounts as you go up here to the northeast, into Ohio, into Pennsylvania, where that other boundary with that cold front will lie, with those 1 to 2 inch rains up there. And the Canadian model is basically implying the same thing. It has that ridge, stopping that front out here into Texas and much of Louisiana, and doesn't have it extending anywhere, further on to the southeast as we go into the weekend. And there's your banding a little bit higher amounts into the northeast on the Canadian model. And then here's your overall model, a blend of all the models. It kind of implies the same thing. There's your heavier rain set up over Texas, over Oklahoma, into Arkansas, into Missouri, and much of Illinois, into Indiana. And it doesn't really have much into the southeast, as it has that ridge blocking it from going any further along, and has those little higher amounts where that boundary is up in the northeast of, basically, New York City, northward, with along that boundary up into the northeast. So yeah, so there's a lot going on this week. Definitely stay weather aware with not only the severe threat, but also the flooding threat, because that can pose just as much danger as that severe threat. And be cautious of that. Take advantage, listen to all watches and warnings that's going to be unfolding over the next several days. So I appreciate you guys watching. Do like this video. Definitely leave your comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel to catch the latest update, where I protect you before and after the storm.